you all for being here tonight for our second NEH Summer Institute lecture. Tonight we're very pleased to have with us Professor Farrell O'Gorman. If you ever decide to Google Farrell O'Gorman, you're going to find this quotation on his Belmont Abbey College webpage. It says, "He believes that living fully depends upon seeking answers to the big questions raised in the humanities, questions that can't be answered alone." When I had the chance to be part of an NEH Summer Institute in 2007 and was able to be a learner from Professor O'Gorman, I don't think I could have phrased what I experienced that well, but it certainly carried the idea of what I felt from that experience. And I think what you'll notice is that when you listen to anything that he says, he likes to do things with more than one object in mind. Whether those be NEH presentations, conference presentations, and I've been honored to hear several of those, or of course in his scholarship. You'll notice that his books reflect that when he raises questions about Flannery O'Connor, they never deal with her alone. His first book, published by LSU Press in 2004, is Peculiar Crossroads, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, and the Catholic Vision in Post-War Southern Fiction. He doesn't take on O'Connor in a vacuum, but in the company of Percy and a number of more recent Catholic writers. His most recent monograph, Catholicism and American Borders in the Gothic Literary Imagination, published by Notre Dame Press in 2017, takes a similar group journey into the Gothic world. Add to this his journal publications that treat authors as diverse as Percy, Poe, Cormac McCarthy, Tobias Wolff, Tim O'Brien, James Joyce, and two of my personal favorites, Tom Stoppard and Brian Friel, and you'll see what a diverse group of thinkers he surrounds himself with. And don't forget that he also has dived into the Persian Gulf War with his 2006 novel, Awaiting Orders. His day job is as a professor of English at Belmont Abbey College, having previously taught at Mississippi State University and DePaul University. Clearly, his education as an undergraduate at Notre Dame and an MA and PhD student at the University of North Carolina, despite that horrible color of blue that they have. Being a Duke, I can speak authoritatively on that. That education has served him well. And for all of his achievement, though, Farrell is also a gentle and a humble soul, an educator in the best sense of the word. Seeking, as he says in a YouTube video, to give his students the kind of interactive, probing education he wants his own children to have. Tonight, you're going to get a chance to know him better. And surprise, he's going to speak on another plural subject. His topic is God and the Poor Await Us, O'Connor and Rose Hawthorne. Please welcome Professor Farrell O'Gorman.
I'd like to begin by thanking Bruce and Bob for doing all the work of putting this massive undertaking together. It's a real pleasure to be here in this role and to be getting to know all of you. This week I've been leading seminars about how O'Connor's women might be understood in relation to those of Nathaniel Hawthorne and Catherine Ann Porter, particularly in light of their common engagement with Catholicism and with the American Gothic literary tradition. What I will speak about tonight is in one sense continuous with the seminars, but tonight I will emphasize a way of thinking about O'Connor's place in American literature that doesn't privilege or necessarily even involve the Gothic. Here's a list of writers: Kate Chopin, Willa Cather, Catherine Ann Porter, Flannery O'Connor, Annie Dillard, Denise Levertov, Louise Erdrich, Sandra Cisneros, Toni Morrison. One might well say that's a list of some major American writers, since 1890 or so. Or one might say, that's a list of some major American writers who happen to be women. Both statements are true. What I find most striking about this list is that all of these writers are significantly engaged with Catholicism. Some born into the Catholic Church, some converts to it, one long-time almost Catholic, Catherine, some firm in the faith, others lapsed from it to various degrees. But all are writers were currently engaged with and or irrevocably marked by the faith. All are American women writing Catholicism, and there's no list of men that's quite comparable. O'Connor is at the center of this list chronologically, just as she is central to the American literature tradition generally, working squarely in its mainstream, even while it might seem that her status as a Southern and professing Catholic writer should place her at the margins. Given time and perhaps 2 sabbaticals to prepare, I might try to talk for hours about O'Connor in relation to a variety of the authors on my list. As it is, I'm going to talk to her about her relationship to one American woman who I have not yet listed, Rose Hawthorne. My initial title included Dorothy Day, but I realized I only have time for the briefest of references to another, to Dorothy Day, in relation to Rose. Day is the better known of these two as a writer by virtue of one book, her 1952 autobiography, The Long Loneliness. She is generally even better known as an activist. One somewhat oversimplified view is that O'Connor ultimately didn't like Day much because she was an activist. Yet O'Connor undeniably liked Rose Hawthorne precisely because she was an activist, certainly in the sense that she led an active life tending to the sick and dying and calling others to do and support the same work. Rose did this after she had largely failed in pursuing a career as a fiction writer. Rose's success in her new vocation actually helped to convince Day in the 1930s that she might succeed in establishing Catholic worker houses. O'Connor admired Rose immensely. This admiration is most extensively documented in her 1960 essay, Introduction to a Memoir of Marianne, though O'Connor knew of Rose at least as early as 1956. That year, she wrote to Betty Hester of the Congregation of Religious Sisters that Rose founded, saying, quote, "I have more admiration for them than any other order I know," end quote. For a Catholic as devout as O'Connor, this is a remarkable statement. One could look elsewhere in her work for evidence of her admiration of more purely contemplative religious orders. Rose Hawthorne was in fact a Dominican, like St. Thomas Aquinas, but the specific congregation Rose founded that O'Connor admired so much is in many ways atypical among the Dominicans in its emphasis on corporal works of mercy, charitable work. Caroline Gordon once complained about certain Catholics who, quote, "want to write but would be better employed praying." She said this in 1951 in a letter to Walker Percy that named O'Connor as an example of a young Catholic who should be writing. Rose Hawthorne did largely quit writing in order to spend more time praying, but also simultaneously to start nursing the dying. In these years, Rose also wrote nonfiction which would have interested O'Connor had it been readily available to her. That writing, and Rose's life and work generally, can help us to see O'Connor's more clearly. In order to help us better know Rose Hawthorne and why it's worth juxtaposing her with O'Connor, I want to do the following. First, consider O'Connor's longtime engagement with Nathaniel Hawthorne and how it's tied to her discovery of Rose and reading of Rose's life. Second, tell more about Rose's story itself, including some things O'Connor was not aware of. Part of the story includes how Rose read and wrote the relationship of Catholicism and American culture for ecumenical audiences, something O'Connor did as well. Third, I want to consider how Rose and O'Connor understood the poor, the sick, and dying, in part by introducing the reading of both women that's presented in the work of a medical historian. Then I'll read a bit of O'Connor's fiction, keeping in mind both the statement, "God and the poor await us," that's from Rose's writing, and O'Connor's own reminder that you can't be any poorer than dead. So, early on, I will be attending mostly to O'Connor's nonfiction, but I will address her fiction directly in the last portion of the talk. known relationship with Nathaniel Hawthorne began in a summer class here at Georgia College exactly 80 years ago. She later relished recounting the story of a classmate who, when asked what the moral of the Scarlet Letter was, replied, "Think twice before you commit adultery." Here O'Connor owned an anthology called The Short Story Survey and wrote in the Hawthorne section a list of weaknesses, presumably taken from a professor's lecture. First among these alleged weaknesses of Hawthorne's was, quote, allegorization, which makes unreality, end quote. 20 years later, in 1963, O'Connor told an interviewer, "I write tales in the sense Hawthorne wrote tales, though I hope with less reliance on allegory." Her sense of Hawthorne's and her own struggle with allegory will ultimately help us to understand her appreciation of Rose as following through on Nathaniel Hawthorne's best qualities. As a mature writer, O'Connor was certainly not altogether opposed to allegory. In 1962, a year before the interview just cited, she had written that, quote, "The writer whose point of view is Catholic in the widest sense of the term reads nature the same way the medieval commentators read scripture. They found three levels of meaning in the literal level of the sacred text. The allegorical, in which one thing stands for another, the moral, which has to do with what should be done, and the anagogical, which has to do with the divine life and our participation in it, the level of grace." End quote. In what sense, then, did O'Connor fear that she might rely too much on allegory, as her comments in the 1963 interview indicate she did? And why did she consistently think of Hawthorne in relation to this concern? O'Connor owned an undated copy of Henry James's 1879 biography of Hawthorne, which contains important evidence. The passages O'Connor marked in this book indicate her interest in Hawthorne as a regionalist whose region, New England, was America's first Bible Belt. But O'Connor's markings also indicate her sense of Hawthorne's great weakness, or at least her sense of James's sense of that weakness. Here's Henry James as marked by O'Connor. Quote, "Hawthorne, in his metaphysical moods, is nothing if not allegorical. And allegory, to my sense, is quite one of the lighter exercises of the imagination. Many excellent judges, I know, have a great stomach for it. They delight in symbols and correspondences and seeing a story told as if it were another and very different story. I frankly confess that I have as a general thing but little enjoyment of it, and that it has never seemed to me to be, as it were, a first-rate literary form. It has produced assuredly some first-rate works, and Hawthorne in his younger years has been a great reader and devotee of John Bunyan and Edmund Spenser, the great masters of allegory. But it is apt to spoil two things, a story and a moral, a meaning and a form, and the taste for it is responsible for a large part of the forcible, feeble writing that has been inflicted upon the world." End quote. That's old James. It's marked by O'Connor. Bunyan and Spenser were quintessentially Anglo-Protestant writers, and O'Connor would have recognized the younger Hawthorne's immersion in their work is entirely consistent with his historically Calvinist milieu, as he lived in an increasingly secular antebellum New England in which Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress was still widely read. James's critique of Hawthorne here in essence anticipates the judgment of critic Paul Giles, who contends that, in an American literary context at least, quote, "Protestant romance dissolves the mundane world into more lucid spiritual allegory. Catholic realism invests the mundane world itself with sacramental significance." End quote. O'Connor's own most concise implicit agreement with Giles's claim may be a letter to John Hawkes, in which she states that, quote, "Grace, to the Catholic way of thinking, can and does use as its medium the imperfect, purely human, and even hypocritical and banal. Whereas, in the Protestant view, O'Connor says, I think grace and nature don't have much to do with each other, i.e., that which is of spiritual and of ultimate importance must be rigorously separated from the mundane. In the sense that I see things the other way," O'Connor says, "I'm a Catholic writer." End quote. To return to my chronology, after college, O'Connor continued to study Hawthorne. At the Iowa Writers' Workshop, her Brooks and Warren textbook Understanding Fiction featured his story, The Birthmark. By 1954, O'Connor was writing to Ben Griffith that, quote, "My opinion of Hawthorne is that he was a very great writer indeed." In 1955, writing to Betty Hester, she listed Hawthorne first among authors from whom she had, quote, "learned something." By this time, she also had some sense that Hawthorne attempted to resist his own allegorical tendencies, his impulse to dissolve the mundane world into something more lucid and ideal. If, following Giles, we see the New England Transcendentalists as the foremost representatives of such an impulse. O'Connor wrote to Betty Hester in 1956, quote, "One of my Nashville friends was telling me that Hawthorne couldn't stand Emerson or any of that crowd. When one of them came in the front door, Hawthorne went out the back. He met one of them once and snarled, 'Good morning, Mr. G. How was your oversoul this morning?'" The same 1956 letter contains the first evidence of O'Connor's awareness of the work of Rose Hawthorne. At this point, it seems O'Connor knew the bare bones of Rose's story, that she had converted to Catholicism as an adult and in 1900 founded a congregation of Dominican sisters devoted to providing care for terminally ill cancer patients, particularly impoverished people who could find no place in hospitals. Originally working largely with immigrant populations in New York, these Hawthorne Dominicans had in 1939 opened a home in Atlanta. It was at this home that O'Connor wrote in 1956, quote, "That they harbor an ex-dancer among the sisters at the cancer home is just another indication of the grace that must move through that place. I have more admiration for them than any other order I know. You know it was founded by Hawthorne's daughter? My evil imagination tells me this was God's way of rewarding Hawthorne for hating the Transcendentalists." 4 years later, the sisters at the Atlanta home approached O'Connor with their goal of producing a book about their patient Mary Ann Long. The essay that O'Connor ultimately wrote in support of this book remains the most obvious touchstone for any consideration of her and the Hawthorne family. O'Connor's immediate goal in writing Introduction to a Memoir of Mary Ann is to make the case that the story of an otherwise obscure girl who died of cancer at age 12 is worth paying attention to. In doing so, O'Connor quickly highlights the dangers of pious little recitals and moves instead to discussion of Hawthorne, specifically The Birthmark. By the end of her essay, she has related that story to the work of Dostoevsky, Camus, and what she saw as a murderous scientism culminating in the middle decades of the 20th century, a time when idealized conceptions of human identity informed the work of men like Hawthorne's scientist Aylmer, who, quote, "busy cutting down what they saw as human imperfection, began making headway also on the raw material of human good." O'Connor's reflections here are consistent with her reservations regarding allegory, if the impulse of allegory is understood to abandon or reject earthly imperfection in favor of some purely transcendent ideal. She suggests as much in her striking biographical meditation on Hawthorne. She quotes the author himself describing his chance encounter in a Liverpool workhouse with a striking embodiment of worldly imperfection, a child so wretched and ill that Hawthorne could not decide its gender. He wrote in his notebook that this, quote, "little sickly, humor-eaten fright prowled around me, taking hold of my skirts, following at my heels, and at last held up its hands, smiled in my face, and standing directly before me, insisted on my taking it up. Not that it said a word, for I rather think it was underwitted and could not talk, but it was as if God had promised the child this favor on my behalf, and that I must needs fulfill the contract." Hawthorne finally reached out to the child, as he also described in his book of travel essays, Our Old Home. Here, describing himself without saying so, he wrote of a reserved, even icy man who in this situation, quote, "affected more than he dreamed of toward his final salvation when he took up the loathsome child and caressed it as tenderly as if he had been its father." End quote. O'Connor is so taken with these specific passages from Hawthorne, in part because they make no attempt to render the child angelic. From start to finish, in Hawthorne's own account, the child remains ugly, sickly, defaced, and it. And O'Connor admires Hawthorne in that he revealed himself critically here, as, in her words, a, quote, fastidious, skeptical New Englander who feared the ice in his own blood and acted against that fear. O'Connor ends the essay by stating that Hawthorne's embrace of this impoverished child was ultimately extended through Rose Hawthorne to the life of the young cancer patient Mary Ann in Atlanta. Quote, there is a direct line between the incident in the Liverpool workhouse, the work of Hawthorne's daughter Rose, and Mary Ann, who stands not only for herself, but for all the other examples of human imperfection and grotesquerie which the sisters of Rose Hawthorne's order spend their lives caring for. Their work is the tree sprung from Hawthorne's small act of Christlikeness, and Mary Ann is its flower. By reason of the fear, the search, and the charity that marked his life and influenced his daughters, Mary Ann inherited, a century later, the wealth of Catholic wisdom that taught her what to make of her death. Hawthorne gave what he did not have himself. End quote. So, Mary Ann, again, stands not only for herself, but for other examples of human imperfection and grotesquerie. This might be read in part as an allegorical statement. Mary Ann is a type. She represents a category. Yet, nonetheless, Mary Ann does also stand for herself, her literal individual existence, her particular embodied life, imperfect as it is affirmed as having fundamental value. And what about Nathaniel Hawthorne? This skeptical, fastidious descendant of the Puritans is one of very few people, certainly the only American writer, whom O'Connor described as even momentarily Christ-like. Furthermore, his Christ-like embrace of another embodied and apparently impure self, here a diseased self, reflects O'Connor's insistence on the value of not the allegorical, but the anagogical. Allegory, from the Greek for other speaking, suggests a leap from the literal and mundane to that which is truly significant, a leap in which the other is gladly left behind. Anagogy, from the Greek for ascent with the C, views the mundane world as culminating in the eternal. This world is not left behind as other, but incorporated into the revelation of ultimate meaning. The foot of the staircase is, as it were, part of the same structure as the top floor. O'Connor presents what is essentially an anagogical reading of the story of Nathaniel Hawthorne, a Liverpool child, Rose Hawthorne, and Mary Ann, i.e. a story that has eschatological dimensions but remains grounded in this world. In doing so, O'Connor employs not my somewhat lame architectural metaphor, but more compelling organic ones. Again, the work of the Sisters of Rose Hawthorne's congregation is the tree sprung from Nathaniel Hawthorne's small act of Christlikeness, and Mary Ann is its flower. Furthermore, this is all O'Connor from the essay, this action by which charity grows invisibly among us, entwining the living and the dead, is called by the Church the communion of saints. It is a communion created upon human imperfection, created from what we make of our grotesque state. End quote. Finally, O'Connor affirms that a proper understanding of Mary Ann's story, quote, will illuminate the lines that join the most diverse lives and that hold us fast in Christ. Clearly, she saw Nathaniel Hawthorne's own life as somehow held fast in Christ, despite the fact that she recognized his theology as different from hers, as essentially inchoate. And she saw his unexpected daughter, Rose, as essential to that life. In a 1961 letter to Betty Hester, O'Connor stated that, quote, anybody who writes anything about me is going to have to read everything I have written in order to make legitimate criticism, even and particularly the Mary Ann piece, end quote. In context, O'Connor is clearly suggesting that this essay could help readers understand Wise Blood and everything published after it. Accordingly, it's worth considering how Hawthorne's embrace of this uncanny child in Liverpool might be mirrored in O'Connor's fiction. In the call to baptize Bishop in The Violent Bear It Away, in the young girl's imaginative embrace of the freak in a temple of the Holy Ghost, following her own literal embrace by a nun, or in the grandmother's final act of reaching out to the misfit in A Good Man Is Hard to Find, all of which involve touching a child of God who seems unwanted. As O'Connor notes of A Good Man Is Hard to Find, this touch is, quote, where the real heart of the story lies, an action or a gesture both totally right and totally unexpected, both in character and beyond character, suggesting both the world and eternity. The action or gesture I'm talking about would have to be on the anagogical level, that is, the level which has to do with the divine life and our participation in it. It would be a gesture that transcended any neat allegory that might have been intended or any pat moral categories a reader could make. It would be a gesture which somehow made contact with mystery, end quote. So what O'Connor may have admired most in Nathaniel Hawthorne is a corporal work of mercy, a touch, an embrace of the outcast, of those thrown away, to whom his daughter finally devoted her life. O'Connor, in essence, follows Rose in this understanding. Rose claimed that her father's account of his encounter with the child in the Liverpool workhouse contained the greatest words he ever wrote. And she, Rose, surprisingly understood herself, even after her conversion, as a daughter of the Puritans, who nonetheless turned out altogether differently than her family could have anticipated, in some ways an uncanny child herself. With that, I want to turn to Rose Hawthorne's own story, only some of which O'Connor knew, beginning with an overview of some of the biographical materials. In O'Connor's lifetime, Rose Hawthorne was the subject of no less than 5 biographies. All were designed to be both popular and pious, targeting a specifically Catholic audience. O'Connor is on record of having read one of these by Theodore Maynard early in 1960. She must also have learned things about Rose directly from the sisters she knew from the Atlanta home. In Introduction to a Memoir of Mary Ann, she quotes some of Rose's accounts of her own work that are not quoted in the Maynard biography. Today, we all have easy access to some of these accounts via Diana Culbertson's 1993 book, Rose Hawthorne Lathrop, Spiritual Writings, and we have one scholarly biography by Patricia Dunleavy Valenti, published in 1991 by LSU Press. Over the past several years, I've been conducting biographical research on Rose Hawthorne myself, and in 2021, I visited her archives in the congregation's mother house in New York, attached to the same building where the sisters provide hospice care today. I first learned about Rose because of O'Connor, and I don't think I'm alone in that, in talking to many people. And I remain astounded by how little known Rose is generally, even after having recently become a candidate for canonization in the Catholic Church. I wholeheartedly agree with O'Connor's statement that Rose's work is, quote, known by too few in this country where it should be known by all, end quote. So, here's an introduction. The Scarlet Letter opens with a rose bush, its blooms and thorns suggesting a beauty and suffering tightly woven together in creation itself. And it's not outrageous to suggest that Rose's parents named her with this rose bush in mind. She was born a year after the novel's publication in 1851, and her older sister, Una, had been named for the heroine of Spenser's Fairy Queen. As a child, Rose lived with her parents in Europe as well as in New England. As a young woman, she lived in New York City as well as New England. After losing her father at age 13 and her mother, Sophia, at age 20, Rose became, against her father's advice, her late father's advice, a writer of poetry and fiction. She married a writer and editor, developed a close friendship with the Jewish poet Emma Lazarus, best known for writing the poem at the base of the Statue of Liberty, and mingled socially with Mark Twain. She had a son who died young of diphtheria, and her marriage was often challenging. Her life truly became remarkable after her conversion to Catholicism in 1891. By the mid-1890s and her mid-40s, she somewhat suddenly decided to devote herself to nursing poor people who were dying of cancer in the slums of New York City, mainly immigrants who were generally treated like lepers at a time when cancer was often believed to be contagious. She sought other women who would join her in her work and would do so for Christ's sake. After her husband died in 1898, she became a professed Dominican and founded a congregation of women religious formerly known as the Servants for Relief of Incurable Cancer, often referred to as the Hawthorne Dominicans, that is still actively providing such hospice care today. If there's anything we should immediately recognize as close to miraculous in Rose's own life, it is that this woman, who had no real previous knowledge of medicine or the lives of the urban poor, completely transformed herself in her mid-40s into a working nurse and administrator who pioneered what was recognized 75 years later as a model of hospice care. When she started in this direction, friends thought she was foolish. You like books and ideas. You've depended on your husband ever since your parents died. You are fastidious and dainty. You have no idea what it will take to live with those people in slums and change bandages in crowded, smelly rooms, they said. But she did this and stuck with it. And again, beginning in her mid-40s, maybe she will become the patron saint of second careers, or maybe the holy midlife crisis, right? The one that turns out well. More about her legacy for hospice in a bit, but first, her post-conversion writing is what I want to attend to. I think it's interesting in part because of the way that it, like her life, inevitably highlights conflicts or complementarities between Catholicism and American identity. O'Connor would have seen this in the short introduction to Maynard's 1948 biography by Cardinal Francis Spellman, arguably the most prominent American Catholic of his day. Writing in the wake of the Holocaust and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Spellman said of Rose, "Why will not our unhappy, chaotic world learn the spiritual secret of this valiant woman who sought out the sick and poor to serve them with heroic selflessness and the consuming love of God? She asked no man his creed. She barred none because of his color." Spellman's correct about these facts. And leaders of men and nations who hold human destiny in their trembling hands should imitate and emulate her tolerance, her understanding, and her charity. End quote. Spellman ends by stressing that the Hawthorne Dominicans in 1948 are still, quote, perpetuating the merciful work of their foundress. Such mercy is like unto Mary's, mother of mankind. End quote. Overly pious as O'Connor and we might find his closing statement, these words help set the stage for thinking about ways of narrating Catholic identity as being both at home and countercultural in an American setting, a setting that Rose, like O'Connor, knew to be historically Protestant and intrinsically pluralistic. So what did Rose have to say about this topic herself? Between her conversion to Catholicism and her death in 1926, she authored 3 major nonfiction publications. In each, she's partly concerned with Catholicism's place in the American story. She was deeply aware of her family's roots in a Puritanism that had defined itself in opposition to Catholicism, and also deeply aware of the post-Christian transcendentalism that had emerged in 19th century Concord, Massachusetts, where her parents were close to Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Given Rose's background and the negative press that had accompanied her own conversion, one might expect that she would feel some need to deny her own particular Anglo-American heritage in order to become fully Roman Catholic. Yet she did not. She initially considered naming her congregation Daughters of the Puritans, and she often tended to stress continuities or complementarities rather than conflict between Catholicism and American culture. Her 1894 book, A Story of Courage, Annals of the Georgetown Convent of the Visitation, presents a prominent convent's history as closely intertwined with the history of Washington, D.C. and the nation itself. This book stresses surprising ways in which this particular convent in Georgetown, one of the oldest in the United States, has been connected to the life of the nation. So she talks about, there's a pecan grove at the convent that's grown from nuts that were sent to one nun's grandfather by Thomas Jefferson. She stresses that many of the young women who attend the academy of this convent are Protestants and are not pressed to give attention to the Catholic devotions of the sisters, which Jefferson surely would have appreciated. But most fascinating here are the accounts of converts from prominent American families who joined the convent. For example, a daughter of General Winfield Scott. Most striking for our purposes is Rose's opening account of walking into the convent cemetery at the very beginning of the book to see the grave of her, quote, cherished friend, the niece of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and formerly an intimate visitor in the household of Nathaniel Hawthorne, end quote. here is a Massachusetts woman of Puritan descent, Phoebe Ripley, who had converted to Catholicism and later directed this convent's academy. Emerson himself was not pleased with his niece's, or really anybody's, conversion to Catholicism, and if anything, became more anti-Catholic as he grew older. We've heard O'Connor's disparaging take on him, which I have more or less shared for most of my life. But Rose, somewhat charmingly, I think, chose largely to overlook Emerson's anti-Catholicism. Indeed, the more time that passed after her conversion, the more positive, or at least unconcerned, she became both about Emerson and about the possibility of America being compatible with Catholicism. In her 1897 book, Memories of Hawthorne, Rose recreates her family's experiences from 1851 to 1864, both abroad and in Massachusetts. Printing many of her mother Sophia's letters here, but also adding her own commentary, Rose articulates some surprising links between her family's New England and the Catholicism they had encountered firsthand in Rome and Florence. The book documents that many of the prints of European art that the Hawthornes owned in Massachusetts, one of the Transfiguration, various Madonnas by Italian artists, were gifts from Emerson. An intellectual whose curiosity had led him away from the Unitarianism which had emerged in the wake of Puritanism, Emerson is described by Rose as presiding in her adolescent years over the village of Concord, itself the home of the shot heard round the world, as well as Emersonian individualism. Rose's own girlhood memory of Emerson is that he, quote, resembled the American eagle, tall, side-slanting, peering with an almost undue questioning into my face, but with a smile so constant it seemed like an added feature, end quote. In Rose's account, Emerson's smile finally becomes a bit forced and comical, so that he ends up appearing somewhat like the Cheshire Cat. Her account of Thoreau is more straightforwardly admiring. Of Thoreau, she wrote this: his enormous eyes, tame with religious intellect, yet wild with a loose rein, a strange unison of forces, frightened me dreadfully at first. Son of freedom and opportunity that he was, he touched the heart by going to nature's peacefulness like the saints, girding upon his American sovereignty the hair shirt of self-denial. He was happy in his intense discipline of the flesh, end quote. We should remember that Rose is writing this in the late 1890s, an era of rampant materialism and crude scientism. Think social Darwinism at its worst, and the grim literary naturalism of Stephen Crane and Frank Norris. I think Rose saw her parents' old neighbors as allies, in part simply because they believed in some kind of soul and in the dignity of the individual human being, and because they emphasized property ownership as a spiritual hindrance rather than a help. Her mother sometimes jokingly referred to Emerson as Plato. Rose knew her Puritan forebears had deemed themselves the new Israel. Maybe she saw Concord as a kind of new Athens. These transcendentalists did tend to deny anything like original sin. It's true. And Rose's father knew this and wrote it into his fiction. He did hate this about them. O'Connor was right about that, I think. But he did not hate everything about them. So this part of the talk has me thinking in ways I'm not going to develop further, but that I think are interesting about O'Connor and the extent to which she saw and positioned herself as an American writer in relation to her Catholicism. I have a few thoughts about that I haven't integrated into the talk. Let me continue with Rose for just a bit longer, and then we're going to move back to Rose and O'Connor's fiction again. Rose's hopes for continuity between American Catholic identity expanded to include Gilded Age and Progressive America in a remarkable serial publication, a kind of little magazine, that Rose titled Christ's Poor. Here, working as both editor and author, she strikingly juxtaposed her own essays and narratives about poverty and charity with seemingly disparate materials. Catholic hagiography, a letter from Mark Twain, gospel passages, speeches by Theodore Roosevelt, images of the Virgin Mary, and recurrent excerpts from Edwin Markham's 1899 social protest poem, The Man with the Hoe. all these together in one publication. Emerson and Thoreau are occasionally quoted or referenced here, the latter as a worthy example of voluntary poverty. So is Walt Whitman, described here as besting a celebrity agnostic in a minor debate about the afterlife. Writing in large part to raise funds for her work, Rose hoped to appeal to a broad audience. Her subscribers for this publication included Thomas Edison and Mrs. Samuel Clemens. But she also sought simply to tell the truth about her fervent hopes for an America that was at once necessarily pluralistic and capable of fostering better models of Christian charity than it had in the past. I'm going to mention just a few items from this publication, Christ Poor, sort of paraphrasing some of them. One is a reprint from an Episcopalian publication in which an Episcopalian priest describes bringing his parishioners to Rose's home and essentially the priest praises the work that they do. He complains a little bit about the chapel having too many altars and tawdry prints up on the wall, but Rose chooses to leave that in, which I think is interesting because ultimately this Episcopalian priest talks about how his parishioners together said there a prayer for the reunion of Christendom, for the good work of the Reverend Mother, and for an increase of such heroic self-oblation among all Christian folk. So she chooses not to censor the minor complaint about Catholic images and altars, instead leaving it embedded in the larger and more powerful ecumenical message of the priest. These particular Episcopalians were from Elmira, New York, where Mark Twain spent a great deal of time, and I would guess that his wife had mailed the piece to Rose, because in the same issue of Christ Poor, there's also a short letter from Twain himself. Getting Twain to praise any Christian work in this late period of his life was a major accomplishment. Here he powerfully praises these Catholic sisters for what he calls their patient labor in faith, their lofty work with the dying poor, charitable work, quote, to which the reverent homage of all creeds and colors is due, end quote. By including these words from this particular American in the collage that was Christ Poor, Rose Hawthorne, here as an editor, continued her post-conversion project of writing Catholicism into America and affirming an America where Catholicism might no longer be seen as inherently tainted. In one of the final issues of Christ Poor, Rose herself wrote an unusual prayer for Americans, a prayer focused on George Washington, whom she introduces as a friend both of holy freedom and, with some historical justification, of Catholicism. Here's the prayer. Father of our country, it is our prayer to our Creator that your piety may imbue the thought of men and women for whom you gave your genius and your possessions. May we leave our native land more like your hope for it when we die, and win still greater love for it from aliens who, joining hands with us, make the blood of other nations mingle with ours for a common righteousness, end quote. This is a strange prayer. Some of the language hasn't aged well. Whatever we make of the almost saintly image of Washington here, the second part of the prayer clearly emphasizes that immigrants should be welcome in America, and that insofar as the nation is righteous, it will welcome the mingling of different bloods as part of its destiny. I'm not sure that Emerson would like this prayer. You know who really wouldn't like this prayer? Mrs. Shortley. Or Mr. Shortley. Mrs. McIntyre either when it comes down to it. O'Connor's story, The Displaced Person, offers a parallel reflection on immigration and racial or ethnic mingling in the United States, and raises questions about whether the United States and the Catholic Church offer competing or complementary visions of the unity of all humanity. Rose often tends to make these visions seem complementary. O'Connor in The Displaced Person makes them seem more conflicted, and she's arguably satirizing part of the legacy of Puritanism in this story. With its images of the Holocaust and multiple perspectives on death and dying, though, The Displaced Person is a story that I want to examine more closely in my final section, which we're beginning now, and I subtitled this section, You Can't Be Any Poorer Than Dead. Popular biographies and articles about Rose routinely claim that she and her homes provided a significant model in the development of ethical hospice care as it began to be understood in the last decades of the 20th century. Seeking more authoritative confirmation of this, I was not surprised to find it in the work of a historian of medicine and public health, Emily Abel. What I was surprised to find was this same historian also reflecting at length on O'Connor's attempts to understand her own illness and death. All this occurs in Abel's book, The Inevitable Hour, A History of Caring for Dying Patients in America, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2017. Abel's study focuses on how the metamorphosis of healthcare between 1880 and 1965 altered the experience, cultural representation, and meaning of death and dying in the United States. I'm quoting pretty liberally here from her. As medicine's imperative to avert death increasingly took priority over the demand to relieve pain and suffering at the end of life. The middle decades of the 20th century, Abel says, O'Connor's decades, were the high point of popular enthusiasm about medicine's power to vanquish mortality. Eventual recognition of the gap between a purely scientific medicine and essential human needs at the end of life was part of the impetus behind a movement to restore dignity to the dying that arose in the early 1970s and still endures, though its goals have been difficult to achieve, Abel stresses. In introducing Rose, Abel cites O'Connor's introduction to a memoir of Mary Ann alongside Rose's own writing. I think it's really interesting how they're tied together in this cultural history, right? A few points I want to touch on quickly here. Abel does document the British physician Dame Cicely Saunders, who's pretty universally recognized as the founder of modern hospice, and how she learned from Rose Hawthorne, saw her as providing a model of compassionate care. Abel, if you're interested in looking at her book, there's a chapter in which she presents accounts of trying to come to terms with death and dying by various people at mid-20th century. She samples lots of different letters by some people who are not well known at all, but she devotes a large part of the chapter to comparing O'Connor's account of her death and dying with Rachel Carson's. Rachel Carson, the biologist and conservationist, died of breast cancer in 1964. Abel ultimately reads Introduction to a Memoir of Mary Ann as O'Connor's most extensive reflection on illness and as unintentionally autobiographical, particularly O'Connor's assertion that, quote, the creative action of the Christian's life is to prepare his death in Christ, a continuous action in which this world's goods are utilized to the fullest, both positive gifts and what Teilhard de Chardin calls passive diminishments. O'Connor would say that the positive gifts one works with are ultimately from God. They often come by means of others, and the same is true of the passive diminishments. Which people gave O'Connor goods that she worked with to prepare her death? Many, perhaps, but the one most consistently present to her was Regina. O'Connor did not have a Dominican sister to attend to her. She had her own mother. Abel mounts a brief but intriguing defense of Regina, observing that in O'Connor's era there was a strong cultural bias against momism and apparently overbearing mothers, to the point that, quote, psychiatrists argued that World War II veterans could readjust to civilian life only by separating themselves from their mothers. Above all, they must not return home, end quote. She also notes correctly that some of O'Connor's least likable characters are self-dramatizing invalids whom O'Connor chastises more so than their mothers. Abel's most convincing statement is that, quote, Regina's story deserves its own account, though here Abel can only present a series of questions. Quote, what was it like for Regina to welcome home a gravely ill 25-year-old daughter and care for her for the next 14 years? Did she resent the restrictions and burdens Flannery's sickness and dependence placed on her own life? Convinced, at least at the outset, that medical advances could not reverse lupus's fatal course, how could Regina bear to witness her daughter's struggle with the disease? To what extent did she share Flannery's search for acceptance, end quote. So Abel will ultimately want to read Carol Schloss's book. O'Connor came home ill, of course, though I think O'Connor might say that she came home as someone who was poor. At its broadest, for her, passive diminishment means impoverishment, or perhaps recognition of poverty. O'Connor stressed more than once that she had a broad conception of poverty. One of her most relevant pithy statements, everybody, as far as I'm concerned, is the poor. Her stories, though they never romanticize the economically poor in any way, often show them as closer to recognizing what O'Connor says, quote, must certainly be the bedrock of all human experience, the experience of limitation, or, if you will, of poverty, end quote. Mrs. Connon of the River, a cash-strapped walking skeleton who is nonetheless relentlessly nurturing, is one of the more obviously admirable examples. One of the more obviously negative is the misfit, who, with his relatively humble background, knows better than the stylish grandmother that there never was a body to give the undertaker a tip. Which leads us to O'Connor's other most pithy statement about poverty. You can't be any poorer than dead. In her story, salvation depends in part upon knowing and accepting one's own mortality, one's ultimate poverty, but also, and this is more easily overlooked, it may depend upon tending to others who are confronted with their mortality, their ultimate poverty. The first time I taught O'Connor's work, after I had my students read 4 or 5 stories, one said, everybody just dies. Today, I tell students pretty early on that you've only got about a 50% chance of someone dying in an O'Connor story. I sometimes deliberately stagger them so that every story with a death is followed by a kinder and gentler story where the worst thing that happens is someone's wooden leg gets stolen, or a fair gets shut down, or a woman gets hit with a book. But we can't avoid the overall mortality rate. And the question is, what to do with the dead or dying? Frances Marion Torwater, in a novel dedicated to O'Connor's late father, is one of her most revolting characters, in part because of how much he resents the dead. We find somewhat similar behaviors by Julian in Everything That Rises Must Converge, and Shepherd in The Lame Shall Enter First. But on the whole, this problematic resenting of the dead is more a Joycean theme than an O'Connor one. What we see in O'Connor are the dying. What if we read O'Connor not just looking at the deaths, but looking at who is taking care of the dying, or even those who are worried about dying? O'Connor's saddest poor are those who feel wrongly condemned and angered by their mortality. In some cases, this anger is sublimated. I'll die when I get good and ready, thinks Mrs. May in Greenleaf. Hazel Motes' anger is preceded by his fear of being shut up in a coffin, which is with him from the very beginning of Wise Blood. No matter how loudly or angrily Hayes tries to preach it, we never believe that he is really happy with a church or a world where what's dead stays that way. When the misfit starts sulking at the end of The Good Man Is Hard to Find, we sense that the unjust punishment he's complaining about is original sin. He's done some things wrong, yes, but not enough to merit the death sentence he was born with and carries with him, as he tries to enjoy the few minutes he's got left in the world. These are the characters forever facing their own impending deaths, whose greatest virtue may be that they are also on the verge of realizing or admitting their poverty. But who tends to the dying? The most extended example of a character doing this may well be in the final chapter of Wise Blood. One can fairly object that this isn't exactly hospice care. At the beginning of the chapter, at least, it's not clear that Hayes is dying. When Mrs. Flood first imagines him dead, she simply wants his check from the government. But the beauty of this chapter emerges as Mrs. Flood gradually falls in love with Hayes, who is arguably embracing death already, and loses all of her narrowly selfish habits. Initially numbed by the fact that her husband died in the crack-up of an airplane, and that her people, like Hayes's, are all dead. Mrs. Flood is attracted to Hayes in part because he already has one foot out of this world. And while she fears for him near the end, she ultimately has faith, partly blind though it may be, that he has not departed from her. I just finished teaching this novel and had my students point out that for all his fear of coffins, Hayes never ends up in one. He ends up in a bed, being cared for, in a home, by a woman who wants to love him as a spouse, but ends up doing so more like a mother. This matters. As he dies, she wants to provide him a home. At the same time, she has a sense that she is learning something from him. And she loves him because, even in moving closer to death, he embodies some tantalizing mystery to her. The Displaced Person contains one of the relatively few examples of a character facing an extended death in O'Connor's fiction. I'm not speaking of Mrs. Shortley, who dies a death as jolting as any in O'Connor's fiction, overwhelmed by her sense of poverty, desperately grasping at things and at the bodies of family members who can react with nothing but fear and confusion. The displaced person himself dies almost as suddenly and almost off stage, as it were, receiving the sacraments as he goes. We see only the externals of his death. The extended death is Mrs. McIntyre's, and it is described as closely as Mrs. Shortley's, but is quite different. As her hired labor abandons her, Mrs. McIntyre develops a nervous affliction, auctions off her cows, and quote, retired to live on what she had while she tried to save her declining health. A numbness developed in one of her legs and her hands, and head began to jiggle. And eventually, she had to stay in bed with only a colored woman to wait on her. Astor, the older black man, is implicitly nearby as well. Her eyesight grew steadily worse, and she lost her voice altogether. Not many people remembered to come out to the country to see her, except the old priest. He came regularly, once a week, with a bag of breadcrumbs, and after he had fed these to the peacock, he would come and sit by the side of her bed and explain the doctrines of the church. End quote. The priest, without administering any specific sacraments, is clearly providing a kind of sacramental presence here. A black woman does the dirtier work of nursing. It occurs to me that Rose Hawthorne would rather not see these duties divided up so rigidly. We should also recognize that Mrs. McIntyre, unlike Hayes, must enter into this experience of dying with the feeling that it's all somewhat hellish, though O'Connor considers it properly purgatorial. Other than the complicated ending of Wise Blood, with its narrative focus on the nurse, Mrs. Flood, this ending, with its focus on the patient, Mrs. McIntyre, is as close to a hospice scene as we get in O'Connor's fiction. Asbury in The Enduring Chill has hospice fantasies of a sort, but they don't pan out for him. Regardless, I think attention to these dynamics may yield insight into other stories as well. In Everything That Rises Must Converge, what does Mrs. Chesney do as she experiences her own sudden death? She calls for someone she associates with home, someone she trusts to care for her. First, her grandfather, and then Caroline, the black woman who was her childhood nurse. If there is a redemptive moment for Mrs. Chesney in the story, this is it. But we are more attuned to Julian's need for redemption, as both he and we viscerally experience the fact that his mother does not recognize him as a person ready to care for her as she is dying. And let's end with the first O'Connor story I mentioned tonight, A Good Man is Hard to Find. If we accept O'Connor's statement that the grandmother's final gesture is ultimately what makes this story worth our attention, as I do, then this is not a story about death. It is a story about a woman tending to a man who fears death. Rose Hawthorne had more than one patient state that the care they received in her home made them feel like they were close to heaven already. I realize that sounds like a sentimental statement. The patients don't make it seem so. The grandmother arguably offers a misfit for just a moment something like a foretaste of heaven. However violently he rejects it. That foretaste quite essentially involves a touch, one emphasizing that the scene before us isn't merely allegorical about the grandmother standing for the figure of Eve or the Old South, or anything like that. On the deepest level, it is anagogical, about God continuously being present and known in our world through the actions of human beings, flawed as we are. I thought about trying to end with a little anecdote about the psychiatrist Robert Coles meeting O'Connor in the Piedmont Hospital in the last few months of her life, and that might have helped to wrap all this up with a really elegant conclusion, but I realize I've gone on for quite a while as it is, so I would like to simply thank you for your attention and end here.
We have time for some Q&A, but in order for your questions to be part of our live stream, I need to bring you a microphone. So if you will wave at me, I will track you down and hand you a microphone until you tell us you are tired of answering questions. So,
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful talk. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what you think O'Connor admired in Hawthorne more specifically, because I know in her nonfiction, she mentions him, but I'd like to know what you think. Like, what are the elements in his writing that you think that she admires? Because at first she sort of objects to his use of allegory, which I think he subverts, actually. Right. But maybe later she realizes that when she admires him more later in her studies.
Yeah, I think that ultimately Hawthorne himself tends to depict characters who want to read the world allegorically, and it ends up showing how they're flawed. That's my take on Hawthorne. Big generalization. So we could talk about individual stories, but yeah, I think O'Connor, there's the conscious level on which she critiques Hawthorne in saying, well, I gotta watch out to him because he's prone to allegory, but I think on the deepest level, she recognizes that his characters are prone to a kind of abstraction, a kind of intellectualism, a kind of individualism that isolates them from the world, and I think a lot of her characters struggle with the same thing. So I think that's at least part of the answer. I also think, as I mentioned in the quote from James at the beginning, I do think that she sees Hawthorne as our canonical American writer from early on, who is writing about, again, something like a Bible Belt. And things have shifted really radically from the 1600s, right, the Puritan colonial era that Hawthorne often writes about, to O'Connor's day, right, to the mid-20th century, where the South is the Bible Belt. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that she latches on to early on.
anyone else? Can I ask a question that's just a little off the wall? But in modern day hospice care, oftentimes white patients find themselves treated by African American caregivers. In my own mother's case, that was definitely true. And that was quite a jarring experience for her, although it becomes an ameliorating experience. Do we know anything about O'Connor's caregivers in those last year of her life? Especially in terms of race?
I would think Carol would know more about that than I would. I think it's an excellent question, but I don't know. Coles, the bit I was going to talk about, it had been a while since I looked at. Can you hear me when I walk away from the microphone?
I'm at the live stream.
Oh, okay. Okay. Robert Coles' book, Flannery O'Connor South, right, published in the late 1970s, talks about him and his wife, right, working in Atlanta in the early 1960s, and they met O'Connor briefly at Piedmont Hospital there. But most of his actual introduction, Coles is talking about the black woman who worked as a nurse there, whom he got to know well, and it was her who said, "Oh, you should come talk to this writer." She'd been mentioning the writer repeatedly, and then Coles finally realized, oh, the writer is Flannery O'Connor. So there's a little portrait of one woman, at least, who spent some time with O'Connor at Piedmont Hospital there in the Coles book.
Could you talk a little bit? You gave us sort of the oversimplified version of O'Connor's opinion of Dorothy Day at the beginning, and I gathered that you thought that that wasn't inadequate. Could you talk a little bit more about the two women's commonalities in her view of Dorothy Day?
Yeah. Well, it's something I want to think about and research more. I mean, I feel right now I've just synthesized the common consensus opinion on it for the most part. But yeah, I think O'Connor greatly admired, and so you can look at her letters, not only in The Habit of Being, but in the book edited by Ben Alexander, Good Things Out of Nazareth, right? There's a fair amount about Dorothy Day in there. I think that O'Connor fundamentally admired Day and her commitment to charity. And if you read through those letters, you're going to see that, I think, pretty clearly. What she didn't like about Day was Day trying to come to the South, which O'Connor thought she didn't know well, and think about race relations here and how to improve race relations. She didn't like Dorothy Day's pacifism. There are comments where she indicates that she just thinks that it's unrealistic. So I think those are the specific negatives that O'Connor thinks she sees in Dorothy Day, but on the whole, I think that she admires her. And I think if you look at the whole body of work, the comments that O'Connor wrote in the various letters, and that's held up pretty clearly. Bruce? I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Thanks a lot for, of course, all of your work, all of your life, and for tonight's lecture. I'm curious if you might be able to tell us, in the Catholic world, there are all these traditions, orders, and people really do think very differently. If you're very much in the Benedictine tradition, you really do understand Catholicism, existence, very differently from the Jesuits, etc. And so I'm kind of curious, what did Rose feel? What do you think, and understand Rose's understanding and participation in that kind of experience, the Catholic experience, and O'Connor's experience, and what O'Connor felt about Rose, and then O'Connor just generally, what your ideas are about her kind of Catholicism. Is it? I don't know. I think that's probably enough to ask you instead of going on.
Yeah, it's interesting. So Rose converted around 1891, and she was, the story of her conversion is, it's hard to know where to begin. She was with her parents in Rome when she was 7 years old, 8 years old, and those memories stuck with her. She talks about that in the book, Memories of Hawthorne. So who knows where it really began, but she came into the church actually under the guidance of a Paulist priest, and the Paulists were founded to preach to Americans, essentially, right? It's an American order. And it seems that her ending up a Dominican, it's hard to explain exactly her rationale for it. She was just working with a priest who was a Dominican in New York in the late 1890s, at the time that she actually was ready to become a sister. So there was a Dominican present to her there. She greatly admired Saint Rose of Lima, who is a Dominican and the first American saint, if we conceive of America broadly, the American hemisphere. And she pointed to Rose of Lima, too, as an example of a Dominican who performed charitable work. So she came back to Rose of Lima quite a bit. Now, with regard to O'Connor, and what kind of a Catholic she was, yeah, it's hard to give a short answer to that. I mean, O'Connor was more, she visited the Trappist here, right, in Conyers, not that far away. So I think there are elements of O'Connor that show her being attracted to the Trappist, to Benedictine spirituality. And certainly as a writer, it seems that she is more interested in that sort of contemplative order.
So Rose's sister's name is
Una,
spelled
U-N-A.
U-N-A. Okay. A major character in Why Did the Heathen Rage
Oh,
is
yeah,
O-O-N-A.
yeah.
And I'd love to see what you would do with that.
Yeah.
if that's a version of Rose's sister's name.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll give it some thought.
She's definitely a social activist and a race liberal.
Yeah,
That's Una.
that's right.
So I'd also like to say thank you, Farrell, for a wonderful talk. And while we're talking about allegory, this was something I studied a lot as a PhD student. And I just like to say that in my view, there's a huge difference between Bunyan-esque allegory and Spencerian allegory. Spencerian allegory is so much more complex and really has more of the features of a game. There's so many variables in play, whereas that's not necessarily the case with Bunyan. But all of the mid-19th century writers like Melville and Hawthorne, they were just steeped in Edmund Spenser. Melville's father had a set of Spenser, which he read at a very early age. It was a very early influence on Herman Melville. And I would assume on Hawthorne as well. And so, it's like, I do see that O'Connor, she wants to stay away from the simplistic kind of allegory, that you might find more in John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. But on the other hand, she is trying to find the true country. She's always looking for the place in ordinary experience that there's an analog to spiritual experience. And I think that's why allegory is relevant, because it is that storytelling that tries to use this worldly things to point us in the direction of the spiritual. Yeah.
Any other comments or questions? Hold the mic close.
Dr. O'Gorman, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that talk. And this is a somewhat ill-formed question, but I'm just going to take a stab at it. I was really interested in your thinking about hospice care in relation to O'Connor, in part because I think of the presence or revelation of death in O'Connor most often as a sudden, shocking sort of thing. There certainly are extended deaths in O'Connor or extended practices of suffering, but it seems as though the mode that maybe she preferred or found more natural, that recurs more often, is the story that ends with the sudden introduction of death. And so I guess I'm. Is there a way in which O'Connor is, and sort of now that you've brought this up, it's perplexing to me that that's the case also when O'Connor spent such a large portion of her adult productive career grappling with this long extended illness. And so I'm wondering if where you see that drawn out extended chronological process of suffering or the presence of death in O'Connor, is it there? What does it look like? Of course, you referred to the extended death at the end of the displaced person, but I'm wondering if there are some of the more shocking moments that can also be reflecting on something more like the hospice care vision, or the kind of death that many of the Hawthorne Dominican patients experienced.
Yeah, I'm glad you're interested in the question. I think the only answers I have right now are the ones that I just gave. Some of that last section of the talk was actually one of the last things that I wrote, and I do think there's room to go back and think through it more systematically. I mean, my answer still is, I think Wise Blood, right? The end of Wise Blood is actually the most extended example. You can, as I said, it seems strange to call it a hospice scene in some ways, but yeah, it's happening. And of course, O'Connor is working on that, right? Revising the end of the novel at the time that she's got the diagnosis, and she herself is realizing what her future might look like, right? Plenty of people have talked about that. But yeah, off the top of my head, that's really that and the displaced person are the only extended examples that occur to me.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. O'Gorman. I really enjoyed that lecture. Also, just kind of on a similar note, I wonder if, like, thinking about the end of Wise Blood, part of the parallel that exists that might be helpful in this instance, right, is Sabbath Hawks with the new Jesus, right? And you have these two instances of these women caring for bodies that are actually dead, right? So there's this sort of strange, right? It's a strange aspect of care for something that can't receive care in a literal sense. So that might be something to consider. I was wondering, so you suggested, if I understood you correctly, right, I think one of the fascinating things that happens in the introduction to the memoir of Marianne is that O'Connor realizes a kind of new valence of her use of the grotesque, right, this kind of positive sense of the grotesque as the good under construction. And you've suggested, which I think is really profoundly right, that we should use that insight in reading even her much earlier fiction, that it's there, that she hadn't kind of consciously articulated it before, but it was there all along. I'm just wondering if you think that might also help us read Hawthorne actually more carefully, right? That O'Connor's understanding of a positive grotesque, right? The negative grotesque, as I understand it, is much more connected to kind of the fact of original sin in the world, right? And that seems to very much be in Hawthorne. But I wonder if there's some sense of the positive grotesque in Hawthorne, or if you think that might be useful to think about.
I'm thinking particularly about, right, the Scarlet Letter, which we've looked at a bit. And that might be one way to understand the character of Pearl in particular, right, who I think initially appears at least as someone who is frightening, but clearly evolves over the course of the novel towards the good. So that's my first answer.
Anyone else?
thank you all. I'd be glad to talk to people individually if you like, but thanks for being an attentive audience and look forward to seeing you next week.